One issue that I hear a lot of knitters come up with is when they're working ribbing or working in cables, the stitch after a knit stitch, when you go into a purl stitch, the edge of that very final knit stitch can often become very, very loose and wider than the rest. Even more so when you've got a cable that is slanting towards the left, it happens even more. There is a couple of reasons for that, but the primary one is, particularly in ribbing, is because a purl stitch is going to use more yarn. So the way the yarn is wrapped with the purl stitch, it just naturally has a little bit more yarn in it, and that extra yarn can very easily slip into the edge of that knit stitch. If you're also doing cables, you're going to be going from a knit stitch into a purl stitch, and even the movement of that yarn, bringing it from one side to another, will also add a little bit of extra yarn or fabric into it. So there's a lot of things working against you. I've got a couple of tips in this video on how you can correct it. First one is a way of wrapping, which is the most useful. Next one is just looking at tightening up your yarn. And the final one is actually correcting that loose stitch when you've finished, so that you can still go back and actually like the way all of those knit stitches are looking after you've finished, even if you've got a couple that are a little looser than the others. When you're working along in either ribbing or in cables, when you're going from a knit stitch to a purl stitch, it's really common to have the edge of that knit stitch get very loose. Reason for that is a purl stitch takes more yarn than the knit stitch. So let me show you. Purl, when you go like this, it starts over here. When you wrap it, it comes all the way around here and back down there. So it starts and so it comes the full circle. However, if you're going to do a knit stitch, it starts over here and wraps just as far as here. So it's fractionally less yarn. So it just uses from here over to here. Whereas the purl, you have to bring it around, and when you bring it, it comes from up here all the way down here, back down to there. So it uses a little bit more yarn. And what that means is that the edge of that knit stitch can get loose because of the extra yarn here, because it can slip into the edge. It's most noticeable in cables because you've also got stitches being maneuvered and being dropped down and all the rest of it. So there's multiple things you can do to correct this. So the first thing that I would suggest that I find the most useful is when you're doing a purl stitch for 1 or 2 stitches after a knit stitch in either ribbing or in a cable, wrap your stitch the wrong way. So normally when you purl, you come from over here and you wrap like this, but wrap it clockwise rather than counterclockwise. So come under the needle like so. And so what you can actually see there is it starts here and you finish over there. So it uses almost half of the amount of yarn of wrapping the other direction. What that does do is it mounts these stitches backwards. Let me show you what that looks like. When you come back to it on the next row, this is going to be mounted backwards. This is the front leg of your stitch, which would normally be in the front. So when you encounter this on the next row, instead of knitting into this side, you're going to knit into this side, which will correct your mount. So it makes it straight afterwards. So that is the first thing you will do. The next thing that can sometimes help, but this is more in relation to cables, is when you're coming from a knit to a purl, when you bring it around, give it a little snug up as you're knitting it. Sometimes it helps to, after you finish the stitch and as you're working the next one, to give it a snug at that point. Because you can find, particularly when you've been maneuvering cables, that your tension relaxes and you end up leaving a little bit of slack come in between the two. So that's the other one that can be quite helpful. And then the final one is just after the fact, if you've worked and you've discovered that you've got particular stitches that are loose, I will often just take that extra yarn from here and spread it over a few stitches to the side. So this one isn't terribly loose, but if you wanted to take some of that out, I'll pull that just a little to tighten it to where I want it to be, hold the edge of this, and then gradually move my way across a few stitches, moving one, and easing out that extra slack across several stitches. So what that will mean is that instead of having one stitch that's very loose, you perhaps have 3 or 4 that are just a little bit loose. And that means that you don't have to rip back. If you've just got one edge stitch that is a little looser, just ease that fabric in across and then use some of the other techniques to try and reduce that looseness as you go up.